We are officially down one entire month of the 2024 fantasy football season. It brought a lot of pain, a lot of injuries, but a lot of excitement. In week 4, we finally saw a lot of high scoring games. So, what are we going to get for week 5 of the season? We'll find out. And with so many different wide receivers to choose from, whether it's on the waiver wire, your bench, or in your starting lineup, we are definitely going to need to break down every single wide receiver for every single matchup of week 5 of the season and go through who we should be starting and who we should be sitting. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. 5 pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is currently giving any new customers who sign up with promo code TheCatch a free Kirk Cousins over half of a total yard to use towards Thursday night's action. Don't worry if you watch this video later in the week. Underdog is going to give you a free Dak Prescott over half of a total yard pick'em to use for Sunday's action. So you guys will be getting a free pick'em to pair with any other pick'em for week 5 that you guys like. And on top of that, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up using promo code TheCatch. So free pick'ems as well as up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. All right, very quickly, we have our first NFL bye weeks here in week 5. The Lions, the Chargers, the Eagles, and the Titans all hitting their early bye this season. So we will be seeing no Amon-Ra St. Brown, no Jamison Williams, no Quentin Johnston, no Ladd McConkey, no A.J. Brown or Devonta Smith, although they did not play this past week, and then no Calvin Ridley or DeAndre Hopkins. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups accordingly. Let's kick things off with Thursday night's matchup. We will have the Buccaneers traveling to face the Atlanta Falcons. Pretty easy overall evaluation here, but let's start with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. You just have to start Mike Evans and Chris Godwin on a week in, week out basis. They've been far too valuable to your fantasy lineups. Even if Mike Evans has struggled, at least in weeks 2 and 3, absolutely bounced back in week 4. As I predicted, as I think a lot of people predicted, going up against the Eagles secondary, 23.4 fantasy points, 14 targets, 8 receptions, 94 receiving yards, and a touchdown. The greatest matchup, as the Falcons are allowing the 13th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, but certainly just a position, even on a short week, where Mike Evans and Chris Godwin both have to be in your starting lineups. Godwin in week 4 just, continues to remain very consistent. 12.9 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 69 receiving yards. He's had double-digit fantasy points every single game of the season so far. Outside of those two, who we know are going to stay in our starting lineups, we got Sterling Shepard, 5 targets, 3 receptions in week 4. Jalen McMillan did not play, so we saw that volume go to Sterling Shepard. We're not starting either Shepard or Palmer, even in deeper formats. Moving along to the Atlanta Falcons, this will be a little bit of a stiff matchup as well for the Falcons wide receivers, the Bucs allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position. But I just feel like Drake London is a guy who's staying in starting lineups. Going into week 4, just kind of had him as, a solid start. Nothing too crazy against that Saints defense. Came through with 12.4 fantasy points, 12 targets, 6 receptions, and 64 receiving yards. Maybe the upside's not super high with Drake London. Maybe the upside's a little bit capped if he does not score a touchdown. But I think the consistency will continue to remain there. Darnell Mooney, on the other hand, I do think is a little bit touchdown dependent or big play dependent, but still 6 targets in week 4, 3 receptions, 56 receiving yards, 8.6 fantasy points. So Mooney's kind of in that flex area. The upside's definitely capped there, especially in this tough matchup on a short week, but the floor should be there if you don't have better options, whether you're dealing with injuries or just the bye weeks, right? So I think Mooney's okay, but I'm not expecting anything crazy out of him. Ray McLeod is now sitting as questionable going into week 5. He's kind of been one of these players who's been pretty involved throughout the season. Nothing too crazy, but he did have 7 targets in week 4, 6 receptions, 52 receiving yards, 11.2 fantasy points. So he's dealing with an ankle injury, did not practice on Monday, the time I'm recording this. So we'll kind of monitor that. But I don't think anyone was really depending on Ray McLeod this week, but just so you guys know, I have seen, some people ask about him as a potential waiver wire addition after having double digits in week 4, but I think for the most part, I'm going to stay away from him and have him as a sit moving into week 5. Next up, let's move along to Sunday's slate. Take a look at the Jets traveling to face the Vikings. Garrett Wilson started last week as a start, and then as the week went on, had him as a sit. If you guys watched Sunday morning's video, finished that video with saying Garrett Wilson is a sit for me against Pat Surtain. Broke down the numbers, that Pat Surtain has allowed wide receiver ones on the season, and just a stay away situation. He finished with 7.1 fantasy points, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 41 receiving yards. He did have a fumble, so he was actually pretty close to double digits, but the ceiling has just not been there for Garrett Wilson this season. We've seen him score a touchdown in week 3. And he only had 14.3 fantasy points. Aside of that, he hasn't had a touchdown all season long, and he's sitting at 12 points in week 1, 10.2 in week 2, then 14.3 in week 3, like I said, then 7.1 this past week, like I said. So, yeah, I don't really think that you're getting a high ceiling play out of Garrett Wilson like we were hoping for, in his first, presumably full season with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. But he is a safe play this week. The floor is still safe. He's not going up against Pat Surtain this week. Vikings defense, very, very good. They did just allow for a big shootout matchup against the Packers, and they still come in 17th against the wide receiver position. So ultimately, I'm not super scared of this matchup. I do think we could see a solid game script, but certainly a game script where Garrett Wilson will continue to be involved. So down week in week 4, expected that. He should be solid enough as a start this week, just a low ceiling. Allen Lazard just kind of in that flex area. Disappointing, week 2 after that big performance in week 1. Outside of that, in weeks 3 and 4, he's hit double digits, similar to Garrett Wilson. The upside's not high. He also scored a touchdown in week 3, but only had 13.8 fantasy points. He had 8 targets, 5 receptions, 58 receiving yards, and 10.8 fantasy points in week 4. So Lazard, okay. I mean, I know a lot of us have injuries, bye weeks coming up, all that stuff. So if you need to flex Lazard at the time of recording this, he's a wide receiver 14 in fantasy football. He's certainly okay, but I wouldn't put anything past that. Mike Williams came through with 10 fantasy points, 10.7 in week 4, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 67 receiving yards. I still have Mike Williams as a sit. I want to see this pattern kind of emerge a little bit more, but it is nice to see that he has slowly been more and more involved in the offense. So I have him as a sit, but definitely a player 28% rostered who we need to potentially keep an eye on as this Jets offense hopefully continues to open up, coming off of a very disappointing loss in week 4. All right, moving along to the Vikings. JJ, not a lot to talk about here. The wide receiver 3 in fantasy, the time I'm recording this, 15.9 or more fantasy points in every game this year, a touchdown every game so far on the season. But you might look at this matchup against the Jets and get a little bit nervous, potentially. Probably going to get the Sauce Gardner treatment. The Jets come in 15th against the wide receiver position. Don't be too nervous. It's Justin Jefferson. He stays in our starting lineups no matter what. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Jordan Addison, on the other hand, talked about him going into week 4. Once again, if you guys watched Sunday morning's video, this was a player who I talked about as a very, very strong flex option in week 4. And also a player that I was talking about the past couple of weeks as a really strong buy low candidate because this Vikings passing attack was not going anywhere, not slowing down, and Addison is going to be the wide receiver 2 when healthy, and that's exactly what we saw in week 4. 4 targets, 3 receptions, 72 receiving yards, a touchdown through the air. Then he also rushed for a touchdown. Nice 22.9 fantasy point stat line. Steeper matchup against the Jets here in week 5, but I'm not worried about Addison. He remains a really strong, flex option, wide receiver 2 option, player that you are either drafted a little bit later or holding on to or got off the waiver, whatever it may be. Addison, a strong start this week. Jalen Naylor took a little bit of a hit after having a touchdown through the first 3 games of the season with Addison playing in week 4. Just 2 targets, 1 reception, 31 receiving yards, and 2.1 fantasy points. I still think Naylor will be involved in this offense at times throughout the season, especially against weaker secondaries, which, by the way, after this week 6 bye week for the Vikings, they will face the Lions, the Rams, the Colts, and the Jaguars. That's going to be a very nice stretch for this passing attack. But Naylor against a good defense here in week 5, we're going to have as a sit. Still think he can be involved, but with Addison's return, it looked like Naylor's certainly going to see less targets, so he'll be a sit as we approach week 5. Moving along, we'll have the Panthers traveling to face the Bears, and Deontay Johnson, 21.3 fantasy points in week 4, 13 targets, 7 receptions, 83 receiving yards, and a touchdown after having 26.2 fantasy points in week 3. This is a little bit of a tougher matchup. Here in week 5, the Bears are allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position so far on the season. But come on, I mean, Deontay Johnson, with all the injuries we've seen, bye weeks here, I mean, you're not really going to sit Deontay Johnson after 2 20-point fantasy performances, right? So he's a clear-cut number 1 wide receiver on this team. We got no Adam Thielen. You do see Xavier Leggett as a nice flex option this week. He had a good week in week 4 as well. But Deontay Johnson, just playing great, has moved up to the wide receiver 18 in fantasy football. Andy Dalton trusts him. Keep him in starting lineups. He's a very, very solid wide receiver to start, and he's probably sitting in like that flex area for you because he got drafted so late or got dropped to the waiver wire after the first 2 weeks of the season. Picked him up, whatever it may be. Deontay Johnson, let's just leave it as a very strong start this week. I'm so confident in Deontay Johnson as a true wide receiver 1 for the Panthers. Even in a tough matchup against the Bears this week, I would head straight to Underdog and hit the over on his total receiving yards, sitting at 59.5 right now. That is a steal. 83 yards this past week for Johnson, 122 the week before. Tougher matchup here, but Deontay Johnson should smash this line. Don't forget, if you are a new Underdog customer, sign up with promo code TheCatch. Get your free pick 'em for the week, and then pair it with this line for Deontay Johnson to have over 59.5 receiving yards, and you will automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, you're going to get a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 on Underdog when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. That link is down below. Xavier Leggett, though, 19.6 fantasy points in week 4. 10 targets, 6 receptions, 66 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Listen, I think he's a little bit more volatile, a little bit more risky. We want to see a consistent pattern start to emerge here, but it was very nice to see him really get involved in the offense against the Bengals in week 4 and actually come out with a very solid stat line. So I do like Leggett. I think there's a little bit of risk involved here, but if you need to flex him, I'm okay with it. Just maybe temper expectations against this Bears secondary and understand we still haven't quite seen, multiple games where Leggett has shown us a high ceiling. So do like him. Very encouraging in week 4, but proceed with caution. Jonathan Mingo, on the other hand, had 5 targets, 3 receptions, 24 receiving yards, 5.4 fantasy points. Not going to do it for me, but he is at least acting as the wide receiver 3 for the Panthers. Moving along to the Bears. I like DJ Moore a lot going in to week 4. He was one of my must-start wide receivers, and I kept saying it throughout the week, like, against this Rams secondary, I do think this is the week that DJ Moore can finally score. That did happen, but then he only had 11.2 fantasy points. So, with Caleb Williams having a nice week in week 3 through the air for the most part, and not having a great week through the air in week 4, but the run game was there for the Bears. Like, listen, I think the Bears are just kind of a hard offense to trust. And then, in terms of DJ Moore, he scored the touchdown, but I think some people are still like, you score a touchdown, you only have 11.2 fantasy points. Like, listen, the ceiling might not be there, but DJ Moore is just a safe play. He is the true wide receiver 1 on this team. Not worried about his volume. The Panthers are coming in as 22nd against the wide receiver position in fantasy football. So I think he's a very strong start. We just got to keep him in our starting lineups, even if the ceiling hasn't been crazy high. Now, Roma Dunze was one of my must-start players of the week in week 4 against the Rams, coming off of that big performance in week 3. Thought everything was there for Roma Dunze to have another solid performance, and he came right back to earth. 3 targets, 1 reception, 10 receiving yards, 2 fantasy points. So just 1 catch. Just can't trust it. Roma Dunze gets moved down to a sit. Sorry to anyone who started him in week 4 based on my advice. I thought it was going to be a nice sneaky start. It was not. Keenan Allen played again in week 4, 3 targets, 3 receptions, 19 receiving yards, 4.9 fantasy points. I just can't do it with this Bears offense. I can't. It's Keenan Allen's a sit. I have no interest. Roma Dunze is a sit. I mean, these guys are just volatile flex options and nothing more. It is a good matchup this week. Maybe you're desperate, sure, whatever. But the only player that I feel confident in calling a start in terms of the Bears wide receivers is going to be DJ Moore. Moving along, we will look at the Browns traveling to face the Washington Commanders. Great matchup for the Browns wide receivers this week. Guess what? The Washington Commanders are still allowing the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position in fantasy football. And the defense was better in week 4, saw a lot of good things, but this team still has a very, very bad secondary. Let's look at the Browns wide receivers, though. Amari Cooper, kind of a disappointing week 4. The big touchdown called back probably shouldn't have been called back. Let's be honest, NFL refs. But 8 targets, 4 receptions, 35 receiving yards, 7.5 fantasy points. A lot of frustrating mental errors out of Amari Cooper in the game, penalties, stuff like that. Touchdown callback just leaves a sour taste in your mouth as a fantasy owner of Cooper after he had 27.6 fantasy points in week 3. But the targets have been here all season long. 8 or more targets for Cooper in every single game against this Commander secondary. There's no way I'm sitting Amari Cooper. He's a strong start this week. Jerry Jeudy, on the other hand, I've talked about since week 1's waiver wire video, because this stretch of matchups for the Browns wide receivers, they should be scoring more fantasy points. And Jeudy hasn't been that bad. I mean, 11.5 in week 1, 12.3 in week 2, 8.7 in week 3, 13.2 in week 4. He's going to get the Commanders, the Eagles, and the Bengals, and then the Ravens. It's a very solid schedule. And before that, those teams that we just went over all have weak secondaries. So this is probably the best matchup of that stretch, arguably right next to Philadelphia, who they play in week 6. So Judy's a very strong flex option this week. Really like him, especially if you guys are dealing with injuries and bye weeks and all that stuff. So Jeudy, strong option. Maybe the ceiling's not super high for Jerry Jeudy this week, but think he is a very, very good option in the flex. Elijah Moore, 1 target, 1 reception, 11 receiving yards, 2.1 fantasy points. No, thank you. He will be a sit for me in week 5, even in deeper formats. Then we have the Washington Commanders wide receiver room. Terry McLaurin coming to life. This offense looking great. Jaden Daniels over the last 2 weeks, I guess really the last 3 weeks, really starting to throw the football, really starting to get in rhythm. The time I'm recording this, I have to record these early on Mondays, but Jaden Daniels is the quarterback 1 in fantasy football. Has looked fantastic. Completion percentage is there. Everything is there for Terry McLaurin to continue having success. He just moves up to a week in, week out start no matter what. 10 targets, 7 receptions, 52 receiving yards, a touchdown, and 18.2 fantasy points against the Cardinals in week 4. Anyone who watched this game just knew that the Washington Commanders offense was in sync and rolling all day long against the Cardinals in week 4. This matchup in week 5 against the Browns is only their second home game of the season. So I'm expecting, a good offensive day even against this Browns defense, which certainly hasn't been as good as it was last year. They are 20th against the wide receiver position. So Terry McLaurin, strong start. The other wide receivers for the Commanders, a big old question mark. I'm waiting for someone to really step up here, and maybe it is Zacchaeus. 6 targets, 6 receptions, 85 receiving yards, 14.5 fantasy points against the Cardinals in week 4. Are we going to trust that? I don't think so. We got Luke McCaffrey, 1 target, 2.7 fantasy points in week 4. We got Brown at 1 target, 1.4 fantasy points. Noah Brown, so we got Dewami Brown and Noah Brown. Noah Brown at 4 targets, 3 receptions, 5.6 fantasy points. I really do think someone will emerge out of this wide receiver room as a solid fantasy option because this offense just continues to improve and improve. I don't know who it's going to be, and we're not going to find out in our starting lineups in week 5. So outside of Terry McLaurin, all the other wide receivers on Washington are going to be a sit. Moving along, we will have the Dolphins in a divisional matchup against the Patriots. And once again, reminder, I have to record these early on Monday, so I don't exactly know how to evaluate the Dolphins wide receivers here fully. Don't know how they look with Tyler Huntley at quarterback against the Titans, but I'm going to go ahead and say Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle are in that flex area. I really hope we get a lot more confidence out of starting them after week 4. Even if we're just getting like a low ceiling double-digit performance, I'm okay with that. Of course, what I always do is I leave a comment down below, a pinned comment. So if anything changes after Monday Night Football, or like any drastic injuries happen, let you guys know my thoughts. I think Hill and Waddle are safe in the flex area, but there's definitely potential that we have a lot more concern after week 4 for these wide receivers. So Hill is always kind of a tough sit on a week in, week out basis because this is still Tyreek Hill. I mean, we know the upside here. Waddle might end up suffering here. He might not. He's apparently got good chemistry with Tyler Huntley. Patriots 21st against wide receivers on the season. So, we'll see what happens. For now, I'm just going to leave Hill and Waddle in that kind of flex area and cross my fingers for everyone playing fantasy football. In terms of the Patriots, I mean, I guess Jalen Polk's the primary wide receiver. Maybe it's Demario Douglas. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if you are starting a Patriots wide receiver in any format. I could see maybe in like Dynasty or like 16. I don't know. I'm in a 16-team league. I don't think anyone's starting a Patriots wide receiver in that league. So 7 targets, 6 fantasy points against the Niners for Polk. Demario Douglas, 3 targets, 4.3 fantasy points. Then Osborne had 5 targets, but just 1.3 fantasy points. Thornton has done nothing this year, total of 4.7 fantasy points. Kayshon Boutte has done nothing. He's sitting at just 3.3 fantasy points on the season. Then Javon Baker has literally played 9% of snaps in total on the season. So I hope someone emerges here. Maybe they're going to make a quarterback change at some point, but this offense is so one-dimensional. Offensive line play has been so bad for them. I almost hope they don't make a quarterback change. Sorry, Jacoby Brissett, but yeah, there's just nothing here. Don't need to break it down anymore. Let's just move along. Except another divisional matchup, the Colts traveling to face the Jacksonville Jaguars. And this one's a little bit tough as well at the time I'm recording this because we don't know if Anthony Richardson is going to be the quarterback in week 5 for the Colts or if Joe Flacco is going to be. And I hate to say it, but I think most people agree if Joe Flacco is the quarterback, that improves the fantasy potential for Michael Pittman and Josh Downs. So this is also a matchup here where we're looking at 2 weak secondaries. The Jags, 25th most fantasy points to wide receivers. The Colts, the 28th most points to fantasy or in fantasy to wide receivers. So maybe we'll kind of err with caution throughout the week, but I'm just going to assume at the time I'm recording this, that Joe Flacco is the quarterback for week 5 and Anthony Richardson sits. I mean, it's the thing with a hit pointer, he's going to be evaluated. It's really hard to say. He might very well play in week 5. And then I guess they have to start Anthony Richardson. I don't know. It's a little bit tough. So Pittman at least did look good when Anthony Richardson was in this game for once on the season so far. And he had a really solid performance in week 4 against Pittsburgh Steelers, right? 9 targets, 6 receptions, 113 receiving yards, 17.3 fantasy points. Then Josh Downs, on the other hand, also came out looking really solid in this matchup. 9 targets as well, 8 receptions, 82 receiving yards, a touchdown, 22.2 fantasy points, 10.2 yards per catch. Pittman had 18.8 yards per catch. Had some big plays early in this game. So, listen, Pittman I'll have as a start. I think against this matchup, based on what we saw last week, we can finally feel good about Michael Pittman, especially if Joe Flacco is the quarterback in week 5. Josh Downs, I think, is a nice flex option, sitting at 29% roster at the time recording this. Very good waiver wire add, as I think most of us know, going into week 5. Great matchup. The Jags defense has just been really bad and their secondary is really weak. So maybe my thoughts will change if Flacco's not the quarterback, but for now, Pittman and Downs, good starts this week. Alec Pierce has come back to earth. 1.9 fantasy points in week 4. Let's just stay away. A.D. Mitchell on 3 targets, 1 fantasy point in week 4. No, thank you. Let's move along. We're primarily focused on Pittman and Downs in that wide receiver room. Let's take a look at the Jaguars, who had some nice wide receiver play, very encouraging in week 4. Let's start with Brian Thomas Jr. And really my viewpoint on Brian Thomas Jr. all season long has just been throw him in the flex. He's making big plays. He's scored an early touchdown on the season. He's a good flex play. And that's kind of where I've had him, but I think in this matchup, solid start. And we'll just kind of leave it at that. I mean, 21.9 fantasy points against the Texans in week 4, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 86 receiving yards, 14.3 yards per catch, his best yards per catch mark on the season, and a touchdown. Very solid. Home game for the Jaguars, a team hunting for some success this year and certainly could use a strong divisional win in week 5. They're going to need to throw the football. I like Brian Thomas a lot this week. And Christian Kirk, my guy, rough start to the season, but solid in week 3, solid again in week 4. 19.1 fantasy points, 12 targets, 7 receptions, 61 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Same deal here. Good matchup. Should be a good game script. Brian Thomas Jr., Christian Kirk, solid starts this week. Gabe Davis, not so much. 0.8 points in week 4. We'll just leave it at that. I don't want to start Gabe Davis ever. I'm not starting him in week 5. Next up, we'll have the Bills traveling to face the Texans. Should be a good matchup here. 2 good offenses. The Bills did struggle a bit against the Ravens on Sunday Night Football. So Khalil Shakir, I think, is a solid week-in, week-out start. So close to scoring a long touchdown in week 4. Almost made it. And, man, I had Shakir as like a must start. Loved everything for Shakir going into week 4. The matchup was there. Game script was there. And the Bills did consistently need to throw the football, but Ravens defense just really showed up in week 4. Played very well against the Bills. I do think they will bounce back in week 5. So Shakir, double digits every single game this year. 10.2 in week 4, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 62 receiving yards. He did deal with that ankle injury early in the game, or at least it appeared to be an ankle injury. He got retaped and then played the rest of the game. He reportedly is being evaluated throughout the week, so maybe he doesn't play, whatever. We'll keep an eye on it, but think he would try and suit up in what's going to be an important game for the Bills coming off of a loss against a good Texans team. Texans 23rd against the wide receiver position. Strong matchup for Khalil Shakir. He stays in our lineups if he's healthy. Keon Coleman, the upside hasn't been crazy high. 1 touchdown on the season, no more than 9.4 fantasy points in a game, but the flashes have been there. He is playing well. He's a volatile flex play with a low ceiling. If you're forced to start Keon Coleman, I think I'm okay with it in this matchup in game script, but I'm not overly excited about it. Curtis Samuel, on the other hand, is just not a start. 3.5 fantasy points in week 4. Not a start for us. It's Shakir and Coleman, and that is it. And we definitely are preferring Khalil Shakir at the moment. In terms of the Texans, they get a bit of a tough matchup here. The Bills allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position. But at the time I'm recording this, Nico Collins is your wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. So Collins, we don't really need to break it down, had himself a day in week 4. 33.1 fantasy points, 15 targets, 12 receptions, 151 receiving yards, 12.5 yards per catch, and a touchdown. Has hit double digits every week. Even in a tough matchup, you are starting Nico Collins. Stephon Diggs, your wide receiver 10 at the time of recording this, has been very solid. Tough week in week 2. Outside of that, 18.5 or more fantasy points in every single game. 9 targets, 5 receptions, 69 receiving yards, and 18.5 fantasy points in week 4. We're keeping him in our starting lineups, even against the Bills. Pretty easy there, but then we have to kind of look at the wide receiver 3 spot here. We saw Robert Woods get a little bit involved. 3 targets in week 4. We even saw a target and catch for John Mechie, and that was primarily because Tank Dell did not play in week 4. So what do we do with Tank Dell, who's expected to return in week 5? Showed up in week 3 with 11.2 fantasy points after a very bad start to the season. He's a volatile flex play. I mean, you drafted Tank Dell to be kind of like a boomer bust guy. We haven't seen a lot of boom this year. It's a tough matchup here, but he is one of these players that I think can still pop off at any time. So do I love him right now coming off the injury? Tough matchup. Collins and Diggs looking like the 1A and 1B. Not really, but if you're desperate, I do think that we can flex Tank Dell in week 5. Along, we'll have a divisional matchup between the Ravens and the Bengals. So this is an interesting one. Let's start with the Ravens wide receivers. The Bengals are top 10, giving up the 9th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position. And Zay Flowers been really bad the past 2 weeks in fantasy. 5.3 in week 3, 2 fantasy points in week 4. So the panic meter on Zay Flowers has been pretty high. I still have him as a start. I still think he's capable of being a flex option throughout the season and can get back to that wide receiver 2 area. I mean, the first 2 weeks of the season, both the game plans kind of funneled through Zay Flowers, even as much as, Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson were in control in those games. 10 targets to Flowers in week 1, 11 in week 2, but then down to 4 in week 3 and 2 in week 4. But then again, the game scripts in week 3 and 4, I know Dallas kind of started to make that comeback in week 3, but overall the game plans did not benefit Zay Flowers. They were in complete control for the most part in week 4, and for a majority of the week 3 game where the game plan was to start by running the football, they were also in complete control against the Cowboys. And then really, going back to week 4 this past week, they were still running the football first and foremost with Derrick Henry. So I think once we get back to some of these game scripts where they're not running first and foremost, which might be what they do most of the time with Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson, but more competitive game scripts here, we'll see more targets for Zay Flowers. I was expecting, maybe continued competitive game scripts against the Cowboys and Bills, but we didn't necessarily get that. So point being, unless you have better options you feel really strongly about, I think Zay Flowers is still a solid start, still tied to a very good offense. So we'll keep Flowers in the start category, but maybe it depends on your roster. Bateman, 3.3 fantasy points in week 4. Aguilar, 3 fantasy points in week 4. They're sits. No discussion. Let's move on. The Bengals. Yes, we will always start Jamar Chase. Said it since week 1. Doesn't matter. I know it was a tough start to the season. He now has 3 touchdowns in the past 2 games, 17.5 fantasy points in week 4, 6 targets, 3 receptions, 85 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Divisional matchup. Home game for the Ravens. The Bengals trying to get back on track, got their first victory in week 4 against the Panthers. No discussion. Chase is a start. T. Higgins, pretty good fantasy day, given the season start that he had. 12 fantasy points in week 4, 10 targets, 6 receptions, 60 receiving yards. Higgins is a solid start. The Ravens are 29th against the wide receiver position so far on the season, even playing a little bit better against the Bills. So I continue to like T. Higgins. Solid start, good flex, however you have him on your team. Yoshi, on the other hand, and apparently some of you guys get mad when I just call him Yoshi, so I'm going to keep just calling him Yoshi, but disappointing week 4, just 1 target, 1 reception, 29 receiving yards. I actually expected him to be a little bit more involved in that game against the Panthers because the Panthers kept it competitive. He just wasn't. And, we've seen a lot of red zone looks for Yoshi, or at least we did in weeks 2 and 3. So he's kind of like a volatile flex option if you're desperate in good matchups. And this is a good matchup this week. Good game script here. So I still don't prefer him. I'm not going to go out of my way to start him, but I do think he could be solid enough in week 5. Moving along to the Raiders traveling to face the Denver Broncos. I will admit, guys, this is a little bit of a tough one. So we've got Davante Adams, who did not play in week 4, still uncertain for week 5. I'll say if Adams plays, we can still certainly start Davante Adams due to the caliber of player he is. But as we talked about briefly early in the video, I'm not really a fan right now of starting wide receiver 1s against Pat Surtain. So I do worry if Jacoby Myers is the wide receiver 1 in week 5 for the Raiders. I think he's a sit for me. Only came up with 9.9 fantasy points off of 10 targets, 5 receptions, 49 receiving yards in week 4, acting as a wide receiver 1 against the Browns. I definitely don't want to start Jacoby Myers if he's a wide receiver 1 going up against Pat Surtain in week 5. Adams, I think, is fine, but the ceiling's lower. The ceiling has to be lower, but Adams, I still think, is startable. Myers is flexible if Adams starts, so it all is dependent on Adams' health in week 5. Myers is startable if he's not playing as a wide receiver 1 and going up against Pat Surtain, but if he is, no thank you. But then we got Trey Tucker, who I talked about going into week 4. Nice last-minute ad He could present some nice upside. He had 15.4 fantasy points, 6 targets, 5 receptions, 41 receiving yards, and he had a rushing touchdown as well. So I do like Trey Tucker. I mean, the Broncos are giving up the second fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. So I think Tucker presents some nice upside. I might even like Tucker more if Adams plays, because then there's far less defensive pressure on Tucker playing as a wide receiver 3, and he may end up getting some nice looks because of that. But this really depends on Adams' health, and we might need to reevaluate as the week goes on. Moving along to the Broncos, my guy, Courtland Sutton, coming through with 2 double-digit fantasy points performances in a row, 13.8 in week 3, 15 in week 4 against the Jets, 9 targets, just 3 receptions, but 60 receiving yards, 20 yards per catch, and a touchdown. Sutton's first touchdown of the year, Bo Nix's first passing touchdown of the year. Claps all around for the Broncos there in their victory by 1 point against the Jets. The Raiders are giving up the 24th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Sutton, who you probably drafted pretty late, solid flex, good start this week if you need to. I'm okay with it. As far as everyone else, Lil Jordan Humphrey, 1 target, 0 fantasy points in week 4. Josh Reynolds, 2 targets, 0 fantasy points in week 4. I mean, I know this was an abysmal performance by the Broncos passing attack, but still, Marvin Mims was on the field for 16% of snaps, had 0 targets. And that's it. I mean, Troy Franklin actually had 4 targets, 2 receptions. He had 1.8 fantasy points. And Devon Bell was a healthy scratch in week 4 after looking promising. In week 1, he's done nothing the rest of the season. So it's Courtland Sutton, and that's it. I mean, Sutton had 3 catches. If I'm not mistaken, the Broncos only threw for 60 total passing yards in this game. I think that's the stat. Yeah. Bo Nix, 60 passing yards. It all went to Courtland Sutton. No tight ends, no running backs catching the ball. It's Courtland Sutton as a start. Everyone else is a sit moving into week 5. Except we will have the Cardinals traveling to face the 49ers, and I will say we got a little bit of juicy matchup here, boys and girls. I do like this one. This might be one of those matchups that I have circled for the weekend. Let's start with the Cardinals wide receivers. The Niners giving up the 26 most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Cardinals struggled a bit at home in week 4 against the Commanders. I mean, I thought Michael Wilson and Greg Dortch, this was the week to stream one of those guys if you're desperate. That was one of my bad calls for week 4. Nonetheless, Marvin Harrison Jr., 6 targets, 5 receptions, 45 receiving yards, an early touchdown, 15.5 fantasy points. Very solid. It would be really nice to see the Cardinals give Marvin Harrison Jr. far more involvement in this offense, especially like second half. The way Malik Neighbors is getting involvement, But I digress. He's still the wide receiver 7 in fantasy football. He's a great start this week. Michael Wilson, never trusting you again. 4.8 fantasy points. No thank you. Greg Dortch, never trusting you again. At least he caught everything he was given. 4 targets, 4 receptions, 38 receiving yards, 7.8 fantasy points. But if these 2 guys couldn't be flex candidates against the Washington Commanders, I can't trust them. Even in another solid matchup against the Niners, just don't do it. Even if you're desperate, I'm very disappointed in those 2. Michael Wilson or Greg Dortch, if you see this, just know I'm disappointed. All right, moving along to the Niners wide receivers, and things are kind of confusing when we look at this wide receiver room, but let's start with Deebo Samuel. He's just a week out start. Doesn't matter who he's playing. He's coming back from injury in week 4, but was still an effective part of this offense. So give him a little bit of a break. His first game back from injury. He should be more solid in week 5. 10.2 fantasy points in week 4, but Deebo, safe start when healthy, always. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say about Brandon Ayuk. 5 targets, 2 receptions, 48 receiving yards. Had a big catch in this game. 6.8 fantasy points. Has not hit double-digit fantasy points this year. So, he's definitely downgraded to the flex area. I just don't know what to do with Brandon Ayuk. It's a good matchup here. This is usually how it works. We're going to panic. It's been 4 weeks, and then he gets a good matchup against the Cardinals, who, I mean, it's not an incredible matchup. They're 16th against the wide receiver position in fantasy, but feels like this defense might bend a little bit on the road here in this matchup. So probably knowing how fantasy works, Ayuk's going to score this week. I don't want to give up on him quite yet. but he struggled against the Patriots, and I just don't. I don't know what to say about Ayuk. Let me know your guys' thoughts in the comments down below. If you are a Brandon Ayuk owner, where's your panic meter at? How are you feeling going into week 5? On the other hand, we got Jawan Jennings. And I said this as soon as Debo was active, what was that, Friday or Saturday? I don't remember. And getting more and more questions about actually flexing Jawan Jennings or not. My stat line for Jawan Jennings was finishing somewhere around 3 receptions. That's what I was so scared of when you really broke down how many vacated targets there were in week 3 with Kittle and Debo out and how many potential targets and receptions there was going to be for Jawan Jennings in week 4. It was looking like a potential 4-target, 3-catch area for Jawan Jennings. And I was close. 6 targets, 3 receptions. He did that big catch, which took him to 88 receiving yards, 11.8 fantasy points. So still solid if he started Jawan Jennings. I mean, he got dropped in some leagues. I think he's still worth rostering. But I think what Jennings is a volatile flex option. We've seen the ceiling. We're probably not going to see 46.5 fantasy points from Jawan Jennings again this season. We might not even see half of that, but he's in that flex area. Technically speaking here, he led the team in receiving on Sunday in week 4. So, Kittle got a little banged up. He was able to return. We'll see how that turns out. I'll just leave it as I think Jennings is a good flex option, but he's a volatile flex option, boomer bust type guy. But if you own Jennings, you probably feel better about him than you do if you own Brandon Ayuk. So we'll just leave it at that. Moving along, let's take a look at the Giants traveling to face the Seahawks. And once again, I have to record these early on Monday, so not exactly sure, how the Seahawks wide receiver room looked Monday Night Football. But let's start with the Giants anyways. And at the time of recording this, Malik Neighbors, he suffered that concussion Thursday Night Football in week 4 against the Cowboys. After having a whopping 15 targets, 12 receptions, 115 receiving yards, and 23.1 fantasy points, the Seattle Seahawks going into week 4 were the team allowing the fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position. So, this is a tough matchup. Neighbors may or may not play. My guess would be because he got the concussion early in the week that he has a strong chance to play. So if he plays, come on, even in a bad matchup, Neighbors is a start. Randall Robinson, who's made the waiver wire video every single week here in 2024, 45% roster at the time of recording this, is a strong flex and a strong start, even if Malik Neighbors, does play, right? If Malik Neighbors doesn't play, I might even like Robinson less because he's going to see all the defensive pressure and Daniel Jones, the quarterback here, but still a good play even if Neighbors is out. So Randall Robinson, 9.8 or more fantasy points in every single matchup on the season, a touchdown, or over 11.8 fantasy points in every single matchup. So like Robinson a lot, strong flex option. I do kind of like him a little bit less if Neighbors is out and he has to act as a wide receiver 1, but I still think he's definitely okay to start if that happens. So Neighbors good, Robinson good. Darius Slayton did get more involved in week 4 against Dallas with 8.6 fantasy points, but I'm not going to trust it, and we don't really want to aim for 8 fantasy points anyway, so Slayton will be a sit. On the other hand, once again, Monday Night Football hasn't happened yet, but it's a good matchup for the Seahawks wide receivers going up against the Lions in week 4. They get the Giants in week 5, which they're 18th against the wide receiver position. Pretty solid matchup. Metcalf, no matter what, we're starting him. He, through the first 3 weeks of the season has been very, very good. Should have another good, game against the Lions. Even if he doesn't, he's a solid start every single week. And the way I view JSN and Tyler Lockett is they're just kind of volatile flex options. You never really know what you're going to get out of these two guys, but at least they provide some upside. So Jackson Smith and Jigba, Tyler Lockett, risky, but both good enough starts going into week 5. Next up, we have the Packers traveling to face the Rams, and this should be a juicy matchup, boys and girls. I like this one too this week. This Rams secondary, we just want to try and exploit right now. They've been so bad. This Rams defense also bad against the run. Packers coming off a close game that was a loss on the road here. Jordan Love's, second game back from injury. They're going to be humming. They're going to be looking for a victory. Jaden Reed, go back and watch, if you watch Sunday morning's video, that was my number one call going into Sunday was Jaden Reed became a must-start player for me. He's currently the wide receiver 2 in fantasy football. This is another player that I've been talking about the past couple weeks since Jordan Love got hurt as a beautiful buy low option to have in your starting lineups once Jordan Love is actually healthy. 27.1 fantasy points in week 4, 8 targets, 7 receptions, and a touchdown. I will say that the game script really benefited Jayden Reed as well as the passing attack for the Packers as a whole, but who cares? I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, he still ended up with the points either way. So very solid fantasy performance, very strong start. The Rams giving up the 31st most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, the second worst secondary in fantasy football. So absolutely love this matchup. Jayden Reed is a must-start player going into week 5. No questions asked. On the other hand, we have an injury to Christian Watson. At the time of recording this, it's believed to be a high ankle sprain. He becomes a candidate for IR. He's on the screen with an asterisk, but we're going to go ahead and just rule him out for week 5. He's not going to be a start. If he was, then sure, he'd be flexible in this matchup, but he's not going to be an option for us, unfortunately. Romeo Doubs should see some increase in volume from the injury to Watson. Just don't forget about my guy, Romeo Doubs. Him and Jordan Love always have had a strong chemistry. He had 7.9 fantasy points in week 4, 8 targets. Doubs is flexible, but the ceiling just isn't quite there because Jayden Reed takes away from that ceiling. And guess who else does? Dontavion Wicks, at the time recording this, sitting at 18% rostered. It's been a bumpy road. 0 points in week 1, 11.6, and a touchdown in week 2. 0 points in week 3, 24.8 in week 4, 13 targets, 5 receptions, 78 receiving yards, 15.6 yards per catch, 2 touchdowns, and he had a chance at 2 more touchdowns in this game. So against the Rams, Dontavion Wicks is a really strong flex. I do think we'll see volatility with Dontavion Wicks as the season goes on, but I think, after him popping in week 4, he can definitely pop again in week 5 against this Rams secondary. So he might even be considered a strong start instead of a flex option. But probably, we're getting him off the waiver, or if you have held on to him since your draft or whatever, he's probably in that flex category for your roster anyways. So Dontavion Wicks, a strong start going into week 5. Let's move along to the Rams wide receivers, who really, I was tempted, what I've been doing seriously since Kupp and Puka have been hurt is all the Rams wide receivers have just been sits for me because it's way too volatile. The target share is so split amongst these 4 guys that I have just not felt good about starting any of them in fantasy football. But we have a couple of things here. Jordan Whittington showed up big in week 4, 12.2 fantasy points, 8 targets, 6 receptions, 62 receiving yards. Tutu Atwell has been playing pretty well the last 2 weeks, making some big catches. 6 targets, 4 receptions, 82 receiving yards, 12.2 fantasy points in week 4. Tyler Johnson, and we're going to stay away from. But Demarcus Robinson has been limited this week and is dealing with an injury, a groin injury. So there's a strong chance that Robinson doesn't play in week 5, and that's really going to open up things for Whittington and Tutu Atwell. So the Packers, yes, their secondary has had some takeaways. They've been pretty good for the most part. Jair Alexander was, inactive in week 4. Should be ready for week 5. We'll find out. That definitely impacts things. But at the end of the day, they're 19th against the wide receiver position in fantasy football. So I think Whittington, Tutu Atwell, especially with bye weeks. I try to put more flex options on weeks where there's bye weeks and, we have other injuries going on and everything. So I think they're okay to flex this week. Definitely pay attention to if Jair Alexander ends up playing in week 5 or not. That could hurt one of these 2 guys. Robinson's health definitely going to help impact volume for one of these 2 guys, but Whittington, Atwell, at least okay flex options moving into week 5. Next up, we have the Cowboys traveling to face the Steelers. This is an interesting one because the Steelers defense has still been very good, but they kind of bent a little bit in week 4 against the Chargers. So still 7th against the wide receiver position, and this should be pretty easy regardless because CeeDee Lamb, 23.6 fantasy points in week 4 against the Giants, 8 targets, 7 receptions, 98 receiving yards, and a touchdown. I mean, come on. This is your wide receiver 9 in fantasy football. He's your wide receiver 1 on your fantasy roster if you own him. Yes, start him no matter what. Brandon Cooks, on the other hand, has just not had that same upside as last year. Way too volatile. Playing at a very, very, very low ceiling. Has not topped more than 3.6 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks. He's a sit. Jalen Tolbert was starting to show some life and then had a bad game in week 4. Just 3 targets, 3 receptions, 24 receiving yards, and 5.4 fantasy points. So don't want to trust him against the Steelers as like a flex option. No, not even if I'm desperate. So got Cooks and Tolbert as sits. Then, we're basically looking at the same thing with the Steelers wide receiver room. Pickens had his best fantasy day, his best game of the season against the Colts in week 4. 11 targets, 7 receptions, 113 receiving yards, 16.14 yards per catch, 16.3 fantasy points. Gets the Cowboys this week. They're 12th against the wide receiver position. The volume's there. Is it a high upside play with George Pickens? No, unfortunately not, but at least this offense is continuing week after week to open up a little bit more and more. Pickens, a solid start this week, but maybe a lower ceiling start. Calvin Austin showed us some life in week 3, came back to earth in week 4, 2.7 fantasy points. He's a sit. Van Jefferson, 4.1 fantasy points in week 4. He's a sit. Can't trust anyone in this matchup except for CeeDee Lamb and George Pickens. Last but not least, we have the Saints traveling to face the Chiefs. This should be an interesting one. A lot to go through here, I suppose. Chris Olave, wide receiver 21 in fantasy football. Maybe doesn't bring you out the highest ceiling on a weekly basis, but he's still a very strong start on a week-in, week-out basis. The Chiefs are currently 14th against the wide receiver position in fantasy football. Not a great matchup. They're on the road going to Arrowhead. The Chiefs defense is definitely going to need to step up in this game, but Olave remains a strong start. Moving into the week, the volume should be there. 6 or more targets in every game the last 3 weeks. Let's keep Olave as a nice start. Rashid Shaheed, I was a bit worried about going into week 4. I've been on the Rashid Shaheed train before. It's a bumpy ride that showed up in week 3 with 5 targets, 0 catches against the Eagles secondary, but he bounced back very nicely in week 4. 11 targets, 8 receptions, 83 receiving yards, 15.7 fantasy points. So even after the week 3 performance that really was disappointing, he's just into that flex area every single week. Volatile, boomer bust. But the upside has been really good. And this was a really strong performance. Led the team in targets, everything. So I still like Shaheed. Looked good in the kick return game as well. Don't know if that really matters. Depends on your scoring format. But Shaheed, definitely impressive in week 4. Don't want to downgrade him or upgrade him here or anything. I still think there's volatility. It is a tough matchup. But Shaheed should be a solid flex option this week. And boy, oh boy, another one bites the dust. That's just the story of 2024 fantasy football. So Rashee Rice is expected to miss the entire season. We don't have an exact diagnosis. Andy Reid has confirmed he will miss week 5 after, the interception and Patrick Mahomes going to try and tackle a defender, ends up running into Rashee Rice. Just has to be the most disappointing injury of this entire disappointing fantasy season so far. So absolutely huge bummer. And, I could break down every Chiefs wide receiver. I guess I will. But all I'm going to put on the screen is Xavier Worthy. He is a good flex. The good news for the Chiefs is, Xavier Worthy looked really strong in Rashee Rice's absence. If you go back to 2023, don't forget there was a little bit of volatility, a little bit of up and down in Rashee Rice's first 4 games. 11.6 points, a touchdown, 4 points, 10.9, 6.2 points. It wasn't really until like week 5 of the season last year that Rashee Rice really got rolling in that offense. It is a difficult offense to learn, all that stuff. Xavier Worthy's going to have to step up to the plate here. He looked good. He had the big touchdown. Still feels like the volume's low. You take away the big touchdown, not a good match or game for Xavier Worthy in week 4, but nonetheless, it doesn't matter. He got the point, 16.3 fantasy points for Worthy in week 4. He's going to be really tested against this Saints secondary, 11th against the wide receiver position currently. He's a flex option. The volume's going to be there. Upside might be tampered against the Saints defense here, but Worthy, he's going to see more volume this week. Good flex option. Who else could we start? Juju Smith-Schuster, 4 targets on the season. No, thank you. Just no. Justin Watson has been the most involved guy here. We look on the season so far, he's got 8 targets. It still doesn't feel good. someone's got to step up. I guess Justin Watson's still my candidate to do so. Sky Moore has 2 targets on the season. McCole Hardman has 0 targets. They might go out and sign a veteran wide receiver. They might wait until they have a week 6 bye that it feels like they really need. They might make some changes at wide receiver, just like they had to do with running back with Pacheco going down. So, man, oh man, in the offseason, I just kept saying this might be the best Patrick Mahomes, Andy Reid offense ever. Hollywood Brown hurt in the preseason. Pacheco hurt early in the season. Now Rashid Rice hurt early in the season. This will help you, Travis Kelce owners. We saw that happen in week 4. But for now, all we can trust is Xavier Worthy as a flex option as we approach week 5. That'll do it for today's video. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. Whatever you guys need moving into week 5, drop it down below and I'll make sure I get back to you as soon as I can. And also don't forget, we're going to have everything that you guys need in week 5 here on the channel as the week progresses. Start sits at every single position, must start defenses, must start kickers, an early waiver wire video, a last minute waiver wire video, all kinds of content throughout the week. So make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.